Mixing the Mind, the story of my photography. Some of you like my photography, and I'm often asked how I got into it, and, and especially how I began mixing my mind with photography. And you need to know that it was not intentional, it just happened. And so for those who want to hear it, this is the story. At that particular time in my life, I had just lost my job as a consultant, which I had been involved in for some years. It was due to layoffs and downsizing, but the bottom line was that I was out of a job. I was 60-some years old, no income, and I still needed an income. I couldn't afford to retire. So I literally had nothing I had to do. Suddenly here I was with no job and just time on my hands. And of course, looking back, I know that it was some kind of a shock. And through all of this, something inside me somehow broke. And I just felt like I was out on my own, as I had not been since I was very young. And I had no schedule of any kind. I soon found myself walking alone at dawn, just as the sun came up, and out in the meadows and the forest, just soaking it in, not sure even how it started. I believe I was out at sunrise, unless there was some serious rain, every day for something like 6 months straight, from late May until the snow fell. And I took along my camera more as an excuse to go out into nature than anything real. I hadn't really photographed for many years, but I started using it again. For sure, it was a chaotic time in my life, a time when much of my outside world was falling away from me in some important ways. So without thinking, without a thought, I found myself looking inward through a lens at a world that I could not or seldom bothered to see on my own. My own outside world was shutting down, and the camera lens became like a keyhole into another, and for me, far better world. As I mentioned, I looked without thinking, and I looked a lot. I've always loved nature, and I know a lot about critters of all sizes, so pretty soon I was doing close-up and then macro photography work. And that took real time and patience. Without meaning to, I was out there crawling in the wet grass at dawn, soaking wet, focusing and concentrating with extreme precision for long periods of time, waiting for the light, or waiting for the wind to die down. I was soon spending hours each day like this. Only, unlike my meditation practice, I had no mental baggage. I had no hopes or fears, no arrogance or expectations, and no spiritual agenda of any kind. And certainly I had no work ties to distract me. As I mentioned, I had no work. My family, I'm sure, was worried about me, but aside from giving me the odd look, they more or less just left me alone. They must have known that I was suffering. I was just totally there in the moment because I had nothing else to do, nowhere else to be, and really no attachments. And perhaps best of all, I had no agenda whatsoever. I could feel that I was changing, but for a very long time I didn't know what those changes were. All of the meditation texts and the legendary Dharma sources, they speak about seeking out a place of solitude to practice. Since I live in a town, there was not much of that kind of solitude around. There were no mountain peaks and no caves. But I soon learned that solitude is not measured only by distance from people and cities. It can be measured whenever we lose our attachments to this world. I had not voluntarily done this, but when my job vanished, I was plunged into a kind of solitude that I'd never known. I might as well have been on some mountain peak because there was no consolation from friends and family that I would allow. I could have been in a hidden cave. That's how cut off I felt at the time. Yet I didn't think of this as being, quote, in solitude, unquote, and certainly did not welcome it, but it just naturally happened. It happened anyway, and suddenly there I was, all by myself. Of course, now, in hindsight, this was a good thing, but at the time, I just felt totally on my own, and it was very uncomfortable, to say the least. Now, the photography thing is going to be a little more difficult to explain because what happened is subtle. I soon found that I was not concerned with the results, i.e. the photographs that I was taking, but rather with the process of focus and concentration that I had to go through in order to take the photos. And this is a key understanding. I even joined some lens and photo gear sites on the web and found out that my not being concerned with the resulting photos, but rather with the process of photography, made me quite, or maybe even very different from other photographers. And they did not grasp what I was doing. At least that's how I looked at it. So what was I doing? What I was doing, in hindsight, was learning meditation very easily, rather than with great difficulty as I had been doing for 30 years or so. And I didn't even know that this was what I was doing. I was that engrossed in the whole process of macro and close-up photography. As mentioned, I wasn't that interested in the resulting photos because it was the process of taking those photos that was the meditation. And it was in that process, the process of photographing, that I found peace of mind and clarity. It was the many, many hours of setting up the camera and tripod, photographing the subject, waiting for the light, waiting for the wind to die down, and so on. I had somewhere, way back then, bought into the idea that meditation was somehow supposed to be, quote, spiritual, unquote, whatever that meant. And my spiritual fears and expectations, or whatever, had managed to cloud up the very practical nature of learning meditation. There's nothing spiritual about meditation, if by spiritual we mean otherworldly or somehow on another plane. There's only one plane for all of us, but there are different levels of awareness. After all, the word Buddha simply means awareness, or the one who is aware. Awareness is not spiritual in any otherworldly sense, but just what it says, aware, awake. So I was finding liberation by looking through a lens, peering into tiny worlds of perfection that cannot be seen with the naked eye. With sitting meditation, sitting on the cushion, we can focus on a pebble and let the mind rest there. The object of meditation practice can be anything or nothing. There's also what's called formless meditation, has no object. Anyway, the many, many hours of extreme concentration focusing through a lens brought increased clarity to my mind. Before I knew it, I was depending on my daily photographic sessions just to keep my mind clear. I was hooked. I did not understand what was happening well enough to explain it to myself, much less to other people, even to my own family. And lucky for me, I have as a close friend Lama Karma Drodo, a Tibetan monk who we consider like a son, like a member of our family. When I explained to Lama Karma what was happening to me, he knew just what had happened, and he said that I had found what they call, quote, the Lama of appearances, end quote. It seems that nature herself, the whole world of appearances, can also be a perfect teacher. And I had been learning meditation from nature herself, This made perfect sense to me, and I instantly flashed on what had happened. I had finally learned to meditate properly. It's a little more complex than this, but this will have to do for now. I actually wrote 2 books for those who want a blow-by-blow description of each step, and they can be found at dharmagrooves.com, and their titles are The Lama of Appearances, and the other book is Experiences with Mahamudra. Now, I'm going to continue on with how I got involved with the photography. Just to be clear, at the time, during all this time, I was not taking just single photos. I became somewhat expert in a technique called focus stacking. Actually, I ended up writing a few books and scores of articles and posts on the topic. Focus stacking is an extremely tedious technique where multiple photos are taken of a single object, like a bug or a leaf. Photos taken from the front of the leaf will say to the rear, each in sharp focus, and then these photos are combined into a single photo where the subject appears to be in perfect focus, or at least in as much focus as the artist or the photographer wishes. There can be 100 or more photos taken of, say, a flower, and then these are combined into a single result. This time-consuming and painfully slow process can give actually beautiful results. And speaking of results, although I concentrated on the process of photographing and not on my resulting photos, my photos did gradually get better and better. Eventually, I was even invited to be the mentor of the close-up macro forum for a site called NikonGear.com. This is a site consisting mostly of professional photographers, and perhaps I consider it maybe the most useful lens site on the internet. Now, the long and short of my story is that perhaps serendipitously, I had created the right conditions to learn meditation properly. My mind was clear of any expectations of hope. I was not, quote-unquote, trying to meditate, as I had for many years, with all the mental baggage that brings. Instead, I was simply concentrating my focus on an object wholeheartedly. And when distracted, I sincerely brought my mind back to the task at hand, and I loved it. And I was doing this process for hours each day. So I've given you the basic idea. What is harder to convey is my realization that meditation, as I was now learning it, was nothing like the, quote, spiritual idea of meditation that I had gotten out of books, etc. All of my so-called previous spiritual expectations were just not real. I'd made them up somehow, or I had bought into others' descriptions. My whole take on enlightenment or elevated consciousness and spirituality in general was skewed. It just was unreal. It wasn't the way it is. The actual experience of meditation was nothing but real common sense, practical, and being immediately present. All of the other stuff that I had been imagining all those years, that I had imagined was taking place or should be taking place with a successful meditation practice, was just my imagination talking. They were expectations based on no actual experience whatsoever. They were guesses, and bad ones at that. It was these phony or trumped-up expectations. It was the best I could think of. It was these expectations that stood between me and really meditating all those years. And even though I did not know meditation, I knew nothing about it. I had already set up some kind of criteria to gauge it or measure it by, and all of which were just simply not true. That was a big surprise to figure that one out. Meditation is just the most basic reality that life offers. The crystal clear, down-to-earth, practical awareness possible that we just naturally have. There's nothing special or spiritual about meditation other than the clarity it brings to mind. if clarity and awareness is spiritual, then meditation is spiritual, otherwise not. And it's kind of hard for me to admit that after some 30 years of meditation practice, I finally had learned something about meditation, about what it was really about. And as embarrassing as this is to relate, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have experienced it firsthand at all. And for me, this just so happened not to occur sitting on the cushion, where I had been not so patiently waiting and sitting for years, but instead it happened out in the wilds of the early morning summer skies. And who would have guessed it? So my meditation process continues, and the resulting photos that I post are what remain from that process. Do my photos reflect the meditation process? I don't know. You'll have to be the judge of that. For me, they are the result of that process, and it continues today. I write this that it may be of benefit for those of you looking for a way into meditation other than the standard route. For me, it was through close-up photography. What about you?